Hello, Lauren, and welcome to the podcast.
Oh, Lexi, it's so good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
That's okay. We're going to have such a great conversation. I know because there are so many topics before we recorded that I said I really want to talk about this and I want to talk about this. So we the main meat of the conversation I think today is really going to be around anxiety and specifically around anxiety for Gen Z because that is a huge topic that I really want to dive into as they are thinking about planning, thinking about having a family. But you've just become a mum 3 month old. You've got a 3 month old. So let's just talk very briefly about your own journey becoming a mum and your pregnancy journey. Would you mind just sharing a little bit about that, Lauren?
Oh, absolutely. Well, it was so funny writing this book, Generation Anxiety, kind of in a parallel timing with getting pregnant, being pregnant. I had so much anxiety around pregnancy and like what that would all entail. When we were talking before we hit record, I've got a very fun phobia, a metaphobia, which is a phobia of vomit, which, as you can imagine, with pregnancy is like prime exposure, right?
Yeah.
So I was very anxious about that, but honestly had a really nice, healthy pregnancy. Ended up having a little breech baby. So,
Ooh.
which I am convinced that breech babies are more common than the literature says. It says like 1 to 3% of babies are breech, but I don't know. 4 out of 10 mommies in my mommy and me class, we had breech babies. So ended up having a planned C-section and really actually felt a lot of peace in that in the end. It was still a very like beautiful birth how he came into this world. And now I've got a 3 month old little Derek and he was 8 pounds
Oh,
12 ounces, so he is a
wow.
big boy.
So let's just talk about the vomit phobia briefly, because I know this is a very, very common phobia. If not, sometimes I see it stuck at the top of the charts in terms of one of the most common phobias.
Yeah.
So how did that manifest for you? Like, have you always had it?
Yeah, I write about this in the book, and oftentimes people who have this phobia, they have some kind of trauma around vomit, but not always. It might be a really embarrassing experience they had, where they got sick or someone got sick on them. That disgust piece in the brain is so powerful, and that's really what vomit is for a lot of people. It feels pretty disgusting.
Yeah.
For me, my particular experience, so my mom had breast cancer when I was 2 years old and was very sick. Of course, I don't consciously remember any of this, but was throwing up a lot from chemotherapy. I was often like physically removed from my house, I think to kind of try to protect me from seeing her so sick. But I think that really led me to internalize that vomit was out of control, was sickness, was potentially even life threatening and death. I'm really happy to say that my mom is healthy and well, and that I saw her yesterday and she's loving being a grandma. But, I think seeing her, at least, unconsciously as a little child, that really led to some very deep trauma for me. And I've
Mhm.
always had this phobia of vomit ever since. And it's been fascinating with the book coming out because I write a lot about emetophobia in the book. So many people have been coming out and saying that they too have this phobia.
Yeah. So did you heal this phobia or do you still have it today?
So I'd say, it's in between. And I say that's true for all of anxiety. It's rare that we ever make it go like completely away. Like, will I ever be that person that's like out holding somebody's hair back at a bar? Probably not, but I am able to withstand it where like I was able to even get pregnant because my phobia was so bad at one point. Like I felt like I would never be able to have kids because the idea of pregnancy and morning sickness scared me so bad. And kids throwing up, that scared me so bad. And if you don't experience this phobia, I realize like this can sound like ridiculous. Like someone could be hearing this and being like, get over it. But phobias are so like instinctual and, there's such a deep rooted fear. Logically, I could say, yeah, this is ridiculous. But on a biological level, like I really felt endangered. So I did a lot of therapy. I did a lot of work to get to a place where I could be pregnant. I did in fact throw up during the pregnancy only once, but I got through it. And so yeah, a lot of exposure and response prevention therapy was really helpful for me. And my son has even thrown up on me since he's been born and I've been able to handle it. So I think that's a big win.
You are totally winning it. You are totally nailing motherhood there. Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you for sharing that. And I think
every day.
yeah, I think a lot of people are going to resonate with all of that. Yeah, so okay, so let's dive into anxiety, because obviously I would imagine that the fear of vomit, as well as any other anxieties that you had, would have really contributed to the anxiety that you're feeling, any fears around birth and thinking about pregnancy. And yeah, so just talk to me a little bit about how that anxiety was for you and how you managed that.
Well, like with all things, with anxiety, there's often we see the anticipatory anxiety is so much worse than the actual reality of it. The fear of what could happen was so much worse than what actually did happen, right? Like when I did actually throw up, I remember saying to myself while it was happening, literally a mantra out loud, I'm okay, I'm okay. And, after the fact, I was like, that wasn't fun, but like my world didn't end, I didn't die. It's the same thing with panic, right? People have panic attacks and they feel in the moment like they're going to die, but no one has actually died of a panic attack. So I try and remind myself of that and my clients of that, of like the fear of what could be is often so much worse than the reality of what is. And, I tried to really remember that during the pregnancy, like I'm strong, I'm capable, I can live with anxiety. My big thing is I don't want anxiety to determine the outcome of my life. And if I didn't have kids, knowing that that's a value that I've had for myself, if I didn't make that choice, I knew it would have been because I was avoiding anxiety. And that's what I didn't want to happen. It's fine if you don't have kids for other reasons, right? But I think it's really important that we don't let anxiety call the shots on our life.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's exactly what I say in terms of fear. Don't make that decision from a place of fear, heal that so that you can make a decision about having kids from a place that is a good place from your heart, not from fear or anxiety. So I think that's you can live with the decision like that in a way that you can't, I think, when it from anxiety or fear. It's much more difficult. There's regret and guilt, and then it suddenly becomes worse, right? It just kind of becomes a situation that can be difficult for people to live with long term. So go on, what were you saying?
Oh, I was just going to say, like you mentioned that regret piece, and that's everything right there. We have to ask ourselves, when I end my life and I look back, will I have any regrets? And if the answer is yes, then we know that the anxiety is probably really getting in the way there.
Yeah. And absolutely. No, I love that you picked that out. So your book is really about the Generation Z and how anxiety plays out for them. So I'm really interested in what does that look like, and how is it different maybe to the anxiety that maybe different generations are experiencing? I mean, is it completely different? Is it just a shade different? I mean, I don't know. I'd love for you to shed some light on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the book is written, a millennial and a Gen Z guide, because we are really seeing that anxiety does look different for millennials and Gen Z. And I did a lot of research into why exactly that is. You look at something like the Generational Power Index and you ask people, what has been defining generationally for you? Most generations, at least here in the United States, will tell you September 11th for us was like a hallmark moment. But there's been so many things since then, one thing after another: climate change, gun violence. I mean, the UK just came out and said that the US is an unsafe place to travel to, right? I mean, there's just so much going on in our world with social media, the inundation of news, the war in Ukraine. You start to see people feeling helpless and hopeless. And when you put those two things together, it's a recipe for feeling anxious, and left unchecked, a recipe for feeling depressed over time. So that's why I felt like I've got to write this book right now, because we are seeing anxiety go through the roof for folks. And, people are either having an avoidance reaction of, I just want to put my head in the sand and ignore everything because it's too much, but then the problems continue. Or they're almost over preparing, and they're not able to live in the present moment of their life because they're maybe engaging in all kinds of compulsive behaviors. So my hope is that people, even given everything going on in the world, can still live life in alignment for them, even with that anxiety present.
And so when they are experiencing the anxiety, how does that play out in someone that is quite young, really? I mean, I know that mental health is doesn't discriminate by age, but I'm just wondering, like when I think about, maybe I think I was a really hot mess actually when I was young, and I was probably wrestling with loads of anxiety and I didn't realize it. Okay, so maybe when I was that age, and that, maybe 10, 20 years ago, that we were all, maybe I was just surrounded by loads of anxious people and I wasn't able to tell, or maybe it really is quite a big, significantly different now, and there's a larger proportion of people who are suffering from anxiety, and I think also because now we're talking about mental health, and now we're okay to talk about our wounds and our our parents, and we're going in therapy, and now it's kind of something where people are more willing to talk about. Maybe we're just more aware of it. I don't know, but I'm just interested in how this anxiety piece looks among that generation, and how it kind of plays out in the culture among them and their peers.
Well, I think that's a big part of the problem, is that we're also seeing this loneliness epidemic happen, right? And I do think generationally, that's a big difference. You look at what was happening during World War II, right? A lot of people will say, well, that time, like, how were people not more anxious then than now? That was a horrible time in history. But people had more community back then. People knew who their neighbors were. They were closer with their families. Now people tend to really live in way more isolation. They don't know who their neighbors are. They don't say hi to the person at the grocery store. We don't know who we can trust anymore. We've lost our ability to have meaningful relationships with people, where we're seeing social anxiety go through the roof, right? It's kind of a joke if a Gen Z gets a voicemail that it's like prime 10, like anxious reaction, right? So we're losing our social muscles. And when this happens, we naturally see anxiety go up because we feel isolated and scared in the world. Who do I have to turn to for support? Who can I share this with? Yes, I can pay a therapist and talk about it with them. That's great. But there's also a sadness, right? That like, maybe I can't talk to my friend about it or my parent about it. People are spending so much more time on their phones than actual face-to-face connection. And our brains are literally starved neurologically for those deep connections. I think that's a huge part of why these two generations, millennial and Gen Z, are more anxious than ever, because they're doing this alone.
And also now we're hearing that AI is now going to be, we're going to get therapists, AI therapists, and you just think, hang on a minute, this is not going in the right direction at all, because it's that human connection that we crave, that we need, and as mums, everybody listening to the show, I would imagine, is aware of this. But a baby needs to be held. If a baby is not held in its first few weeks, it will die. It needs that loving connection, and that is a thing that we all humans need. It doesn't stop when you stop being a baby. You continue to need that human connection, and so this kind of stuck to the phone, only engaging through an app, only messaging through apps, not meeting up. Even when they do meet up, they're all on their phones together rather than leaving the phones at the door. I just had all my family around, and they were all just sitting in the same room, just on phones. You're like, what are you doing? Give me the phones. Like, we got to stop this, like it's really difficult. And then also I'm hearing, colleagues and friends that say, when we have some young people starting, we've got to train them on how to answer a telephone, which again is kind of reinforces that sense of this difficulty with social connection. So where do we start in addressing this? How can we help people with this? Where's the starting point?
Well, we mentioned exposure and response therapy, and honestly, that's the best treatment for something like this, is to actually practice this. I'm a big behaviorist as a psychologist. It's great to work on your mindset, but the brain has to behaviorally see that we're capable of these things that make us uncomfortable. So yes, leaving a voicemail on the phone, right? Or asking a friend out to dinner or lunch and having a rule, we're not going to pull our phones out, right? The more we can have that eye contact, that face-to-face, and even talking to a stranger, right? I just read a study the other day that interacting with strangers is like so good for our brain health. And actually those interactions tend to go way better than we expect they will. But we just need to build more community. And if that's even setting a goal of like, today I'm going to smile at someone, or today I'm going to ask, the grocer how they're doing, even though that makes me feel like I'm going to crawl out of my skin. We start to have those corrective experiences to see like, oh, either somebody was friendly back to me, or maybe it was a neutral interaction. But rarely are we going to like get into a fight with someone when we're kind and nice to someone, right? So we have to practice these things more. And I think older generations can be a part of that too, by really asking young adults like, hey, how's it going? Like, what's going on for you today? Right. And really trying to help pull Gen Z and millennial out so that, you know, they're engaging more, because we know that mentorships across generations is huge, and that's not really happening either.
And so how does this anxiety then feed into those that may be thinking about planning a family, or that are thinking about becoming parents? Because you mentioned some things that are happening in society that are really kind of that are quite terrifying when you kind of spend too long thinking about them. And of course, we've all been through that collective traumatic experience that is COVID, whether it's lockdown, the isolation that brought on, but also that did in some areas foster some sense of community. I know in some areas in the UK, everyone was out trapping at night and they got to know their neighbours and they were chatting over the fence. And there was a little bit of community that started to kind of building up. Certainly where I was, we got to know our neighbours a lot more. So I think that as a mixed bag, but in the most part, I think a lot of people felt the isolation, the disconnection from family, the fear of that whole situation that played out. But, you know, like you said, there's the climate change narrative that is a lot of women that I'm in contact with is saying, well, I don't know if it's right that I should bring a child into the world. This is what's making me think twice. Then you've got the community. We know that it takes a village to raise a family, and there isn't a village. So it's hard work. People aren't with their families anymore. They've moved away. So how does this anxiety in the work that you've done, how does that play out with those that are planning families or thinking about wanting a family?
Well, and that's spot on. We see right now that about 40% of young adults are saying, I don't want to have kids because of the anxiety around things like climate change and things like that. And you hear of a lot of dinks, right? Double income, no kids. That's kind of a name that we have here in the States for people who want to make that choice. I really come back to values here. What are your personal values? If a personal value is, I want to bring someone into this world and teach them how to be, a citizen that makes a difference. I want to help teach someone learn how to grow. Then if that's a value for you, how can we help you reason with the anxiety that comes from that? And I often will say, values induction is not about pain reduction. A lot of times we want to make choices because we don't want to feel pain. We don't want to feel uncomfortable. There's a lot of things about pregnancy, having a child that include pain, that include discomfort. And if we're so set on just being comfortable all the time, why would anyone have kids, right? But are there things that come out of it that are so meaningful to you that you want to build this family that is going to hopefully help contribute to the world, right? Make things better. Then I think that's something we have to be willing to sit with that discomfort, because there's so much good that comes out of it. I think that's something that's really important for us to hold in the conversation of all of this. Is not about reducing our pain. It's about inducing the values there. So yeah, it's not an easy call. I totally want to acknowledge that. But at the same time, I think we need more people being a part of the solution than the problem.
I think the avoidance of discomfort, where a lot of, I think, I grew up before phones. I'm giving away my age now, obviously. But, the idea, but I think now we've been very used to having immediate gratification, things being very easy, smart apps, smartphones, they're smart everywhere. And really having this convenient, I'm going to order it now. And if it's not here by 8 o'clock tonight, then I'm not ordering from them again. This idea, I've now moved to rural France, so that if I order off Amazon, I'd be lucky to get it within 4 days. So the idea of getting it later that day, which was my old reality, is So I've had a bit of a kind of wake-up call on that. But the sense of community, and actually when there's other things that are able to take hold and to be nurtured, which are meaningful connections and being within a natural environment, some of those things are really, I'm really recognizing now how much how important they are for me. When I was disconnected from all of that, I kind of didn't realize how much I was missing, kind of thing, But we do this convenience thing. We kind of, if it's too hard work, I'm not going to go into town, that's a pain. I'm going to have to park the car and I'll stand in a queue. And if they're not, if I haven't got what I want, I'm going to go to another one. And, oh my goodness, all this drama, this hard work. It's easy to do it with the app. We're now kind of can't even handle hard work or an effort. And so even things that take effort, that isn't really difficult per se, it's just time, just got to kind of get off your bum and do it. A lot of people shy away from that now.
It's so true. And we have more free time than we ever have historically before. But it doesn't feel like that to people, you know? And we're so willing to we don't want to be uncomfortable. So that constant like go, 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 that unwillingness to sit in any kind of inconvenience is definitely impacting our brain on a neurological level. And I would argue it's even affecting, things like diagnosis rates of ADHD. An amazing book, Stolen Focus by Johann Hari, talks about, as we're seeing such a surge in social media and just this instantaneousness, yes, we're having difficulty concentrating, but it's being diagnosed as ADHD when could it actually be that, our environment is just so overstimulating and so fast paced?
Yeah. I think that I don't want to call it lack of attention, but that inability to stay with something a little bit longer. So some of that, I've moved to France now, so their approach to films, for example, is a lot slower. They'll really gonna, labor the point to and where Western Hollywood movies, that kind of thing, it's like go, 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 go. It's kind of, there's no hanging about, and they won't allow that. So but when you're now working with 30-second, 20-second reels on Instagram, this kind of like TikTok generation where if it's not funny within 15 seconds, they're on to the next one. Then, goodness, how can they sit and read a book? How do, or even kind of move past that period where something might feel uncomfortable to sit with discomfort long enough to kind of make it through the point. So I think in an early, when you have a moment that might feel a little bit uncomfortable at first, where those of us that maybe have been used to that, you kind of realize that that's only that's the beginning of it, and then you sit with it and you kind of ride through that, and then you're like, oh no, actually I'm okay. But if you can't sit through that first bit, you shy away from it every time, and you never learn that actually you can handle discomfort, it's fine, and actually it's nothing to be afraid of. You can actually, it makes you feel, that's where you get your confidence from sometimes, is going through a lot of those uncomfortable experiences and knowing, hey, throw anything at me, I can deal with it. How can we teach people to kind of maybe live with discomfort, which I feel is maybe the early signs of anxiety developing? It's the beginnings of it, potentially. What do you think?
Yeah, I think mindfulness is huge. I really do. And we are losing this ability where, I've even had clients will be a minute into a mindfulness session and they will interrupt and say, this is too hard. It feels really hard to just sit with ourselves. And mindfulness is not about feeling relaxed. It's actually about learning how to just be in our bodies. So anything that kind of requires you to sit with it, whether it's going to an exercise class, right? Where socially it might be kind of weird if 20 minutes in you just walk out of the yoga studio, but where there's some social scripts of like, okay, I got to hang in there with this. That's teaching us how to really sustain our attention and stay with, and in turn learn how to sit with discomfort. We've got to practice that. Even a little bit of a silly exercise, but a good way to harness this a little bit. Let's say you have an itch on your face and you really want to scratch your nose. A lot of times we'll just do it right away, right? But mindfulness would be, okay, can I sit with that discomfort of like, ooh, I really want to itch my nose, but can I hold this? And that's just a simple exercise that kind of elucidates the example of this, of learning how to sit in that discomfort and seeing that we can handle it.
And so what other things can they do? Because it sounds to me like really maybe to help this generation maybe better cope is these little exercises like the one you've just shown us now. It's very simple and really easy to do. I know I've done that loads in meetings at work where you're like, oh no, I can't, I don't know, gotta sit.
Right.
So then, is it really something, are we really asking them and saying to them that you've got to kind of take this on? This is for you to kind of, this is for you to own and to kind of figure out and fix yourself. It feels like a really mean thing to say, but also you have got to take responsibility for your own mental health, your own emotional well-being, and notice when things are starting to unravel and take action. It feels like there's a at one end it's me sounding super mean, like, well, you got to like own your stuff and like crack on and sort it out, which obviously isn't very empathetic and helpful, but also there's a part of that where you do need to just kind of throw a pair and just find the help, go and find the resources, go and find the therapist, go and find the support, make them go and do the things. Where do you sit on that? Do I sound super mean here, or is it
I don't think you're sounding like a jerk. I mean, I really like this idea. I write about this in the book a lot, called empowered acceptance. And it's really taking this both and approach. Like, we have to accept and acknowledge the realities of this world, that life is really hard and scary. It's not about gaslighting ourselves and saying like, it's not that bad. No, like sometimes it is that bad and it does really feel hard, accepting that, not avoiding that, and being empowered to still taking action, right? Acceptance is not about apathy and just throwing our hands up and saying, well, I guess we're all screwed, right? It's saying like, no, like what can I do in my own life to take action? And what can I do to be a part of the solution with climate change, for example, versus, just standing on the sidelines, shaking my boots kind of thing. So we have to be a part of the solution in that sense. On an individual level, I'm a huge advocate for holistic healing. Obviously I'm a therapist. I'm a big fan of therapy, but I really think we've got to look at so many forms of healing, whether it's acupuncture, whether it's nutrition and the food we put into our body. I mean, the research on the gut-brain connection and how that impacts anxiety with the foods we're eating, that's something that we can, take action with. So it's really looking at a lot of different avenues and seeing what works well for each individual person and putting in the time to do that. That's well worth the effort instead of just checking the boxes on all the other things on our to-do list.
I think one of the holistic healing point is a really, really important one, I think. And I think for some people going in, the way I see it is like, sometimes your mental health or emotional well-being, let's call that's maybe the most pressing challenge that you're facing. And so you could go in through the front door and deal with that head on, or you can maybe sneak in through the garden and maybe just do some exercise and maybe start running or doing something that's going to build your physical strength. The nutrition, another back garden route where you can start doing things from the edges. And then that builds up your overall health in other ways that then can give you the strength to then think, I think I can tackle the front door now. Whereas without those things, maybe you kind of felt that was a bit too much. Whereas if you take the back door, you can still help the emotional well-being through your nutrition, through the exercise, but it's just doing it in a slightly roundabout way that's still helpful.
I love that metaphor. That was so cool. I'm going to use that with clients. That's beautiful.
Yeah, I think that can really help where they haven't got the emotional strength, because I think tackling anxiety does require you, with the work I do around helping people to get rid of their phobias. With my approach, you have to eyeball the phobia, you have to eyeball the fear, and that takes a lot of guts, to do that. A lot of people can't. That's too difficult for them to do it because of maybe the trauma or whatever they've gone through. And so, to help those people still bring about a transformation, maybe it's the gentle approach is what works best for them because they can take it easier by. And this is where I use the garden approach, where you build up strength in other ways so that you can then come back to the phobia and then deal with that once you've got more emotional strength within you to be able to deal with that.
Totally. Well, and I always love to have like an anxiety hierarchy with clients and myself of like, where am I at in terms of how anxiety provoking this is for me? I always say, and the research shows the sweet spot is like a 4 to 6. So if you're like at a 4 to 6 range in terms of a scale of 1 to 10, that tells us like, okay, like this is a good challenge. Let's go for it. But if it's like a 7 to 10 for you of like, this is going to be too much for me to face this right now, we've got to honor that, right? It's not always just about like pushing through, because sometimes that can like re-traumatize or make the anxiety worse for someone actually.
And what about for those that maybe are struggling with maybe new kids, newborns that are dealing with this kind of anxiety?
Yeah, I get that. Oh man, and the existential anxiety, I think around kids, I really feel that like a new anxiety for the first time of like, what happens if something happens to my spouse or something like that, right? It can trigger all kinds of anxieties. I like to use what's called the 4Ds. This is from one of my best professors, Dr. Henderson. So this is helpful for parents listening, some cues that maybe the anxiety is next level and might benefit from some help. Is if you're noticing any kind of distress where you yourself are like, I'm worried about how worried I am. Like, this doesn't seem like my normal pace. And if there's deviance from your norm, right? If you're noticing this isn't normal for me, or when I'm looking at my peer group and other parents, I'm not hearing them endorse this same level of worrying or checking behavior. They're not checking their infants, multiple times in the night to see if they're breathing. Okay, what could be going on there? there's any kind of dysfunction, if you're not able to keep up with the things in your life, if you're not able to go to the pediatrician appointment, or, maybe go to your exercise routine, right? Because you feel like I can't keep up with my life. And lastly, if there's any kind of danger, and we have to normalize this last point, if you yourself are feeling unsafe, if you're having thoughts of, I just wish I wasn't alive for this right now, or if I could just go to sleep and never wake up, or if you're feeling danger towards others, those are all signs that it would be good to get some support, for those symptoms. And we got to normalize all of that, because postpartum anxiety is actually more common than postpartum depression.
Yeah. And I think prenatal anxiety isn't talked about enough as well, because prenatal anxiety is huge. And we hear a lot about postpartum depression. So we hear a lot about that. But I think those women that suffer extreme anxiety, the minute they find out they're pregnant, a lot of those women possibly have tocophobia and they don't realize that tocophobia is a thing. So no awareness of that. So they're wrestling with these feelings that they literally don't understand. And I know that, I've got clients that suddenly their anxiety just goes off the chart the minute they're pregnant. The minute baby comes out, everything's back to normal again. And it's just like the carrying of a baby in their body is kind of the stuff that really just explodes the anxiety for them. And so, just talk a little bit about some prenatal anxiety with the work that you do.
Yeah, no. And I'm so glad that you bring that up, because it definitely is not talked about enough. And a lot of times people do get surprised by that experience. What's hard is that in any other situation, pretty much, you are consenting to the exposure, right? Like when I was doing my exposure therapy for emetophobia, I am choosing to look at pictures and videos of people vomiting. When you're pregnant, you're not necessarily choosing whether or not you want to have that exposure. It is happening to you. I remember being pregnant and saying, it's like I've gotten on a roller coaster and I can't get off the ride. And that almost can really have feelings of claustrophobia for people, right? That sense of like entrapment. So that's where that mindfulness piece is really, really key, of the distress tolerance of like, ooh, I'm feeling uncomfortable in my body right now. And that's okay. It's not fun, but let me like sit through this and sit in this and bring in support too, whether it's your partner or someone else in your life. There'd be so many times where I would voice to my partner, I'm feeling kind of panicky right now. Can you sit by me and I'd like to hold your hand, kind of thing, right? And music is huge. I think music can really help us get in another headspace. When my son was born, I had a whole birth playlist, and that really affected my mood. So lean into music or whatever engages you from a senses standpoint, and that can help you too when we're starting to like really get in our head with the anxiety.
Yeah, music is a game changer, actually. I'm glad you mentioned it, because it's so simple and it's something that we all have access to readily, usually. And it's hard. It's who doesn't have access to music, even if you just, and so, and knowing which tunes can really lift you. I've got some go-to tunes that always get me going, and that I love,
What is yours? I want to hear.
Oh my God, I have so many. I used to DJ, so you probably see some of the records behind me. So I've got a lot of tunes that will get me going.
That's a fun fact.
Was not very good at to stop the minute my daughter was throwing my records all over the floor and playing with my decks. But yeah, having music, like knowing what music that having all of that maybe stored on your phone, or make yourself a Spotify playlist where you've got them to hand really easily. I think it's creating these little shortcuts so that when you are in a state like that, you can reach for stuff easily. And like the one thing that I notice is that when I'm not in a good place, I've got loads of tools and things that I use, but when I'm not in a good place, I forget all of them. Like, do you know what I mean? You're in that state and you're like, after I'm like, oh my God, I could have done this and I could have done this. And I'm like, why did I not do any of that? And I feel like I need to have a great big notice up. So it's saying like, if you're feeling crap today, go through this list, and so I'm just thinking, are there any little like really easy go-tos, like the music one you just shared, that can music help you?
We love to help people create like a self-care kit, and it engages all the senses. So what's something you can touch, whether it's like a little fabric or something that feels nice for you? What's something you can smell? Aromatherapy is huge, and peppermint is especially a good one for anxiety and helps with nausea too. Of course, I know that one, right? What can you hear, whether it's sound with music or a sound machine, is really helpful. I love listening to guided mindfulness with the Calm app. And I believe, maybe you'll know better than I, but there's a hypnobirthing app that got me through my pregnancy. So everybody should download. I want to say it's called Birth. That is so, so good. And then your other senses, what am I forgetting? A sight, what is something visually that's great for you, whether it's a picture of your family that you have in this box, or maybe a quote that you like to read. And then taste. So whether it's a peppermint candy, piece of gum, sour candy helps with anxiety. So have it all in a little box, your self-care soothing box, and that can be some nice things to turn to.
Yeah, but maybe not the bottle of wine for your taste, because that might not be a good
No.
But a lot of I know a lot of new mothers do turn to that. I joke, but actually the glass of wine is and also drinking is such a, certainly within British culture, it's such a accepted, if you suddenly announce that you're not drinking anymore, you've got to deal with a lot of kind of friction from people going, what are you doing? Why are you, look at you not being fun anymore? This kind of like, there's a lot of culture around drinking, but also when you have that, there's an association, a very powerful association, that when you take that first sip of wine, it just feels like you're home. And when you've had like kids screaming around all day, there is a huge thing with mums getting together, having wine, and then before they know it, they're drinking wine every night, and maybe husband's away or he's working late, and they're drinking half a bottle a night, maybe a bottle a night, and it can kind of escalate very rapidly, I think, with dealing with that new mum anxiety and the stress of navigating that journey. I don't know, do you want to talk to that?
No doubt about it. And that is so true. And, one thing that I think can be helpful in terms of deciding whether or not to drink, we see that alcohol is really inflammatory and really contributes to the increase of anxiety. If you even start to test it out of like, ooh, how do I feel the next day after I drink? A lot of people will tell you, I actually noticed a spike up in my anxiety. It creates this negative feedback loop. And the other piece too is we know that alcohol affects not just the first night of sleep, but the second night of sleep. And if you're drinking every other day, your sleep cycle is never getting a chance to recalibrate. And sleep is a huge part of anxiety and depression as well. So that to me is like enough of a buy-in of like, ooh, yep, I don't want that increase in anxiety any more than like is already happening in my body. And if alcohol is something I can do to reduce that by cutting back on the inflammation, then that's something that I think can be good. And it's nice to see, like, I'm seeing a lot more like mocktail culture of like more fun drinks that don't have to have the alcohol in it. So we're still getting the culture and community of drinking something together, but it not having to have alcohol in it.
Yeah. So yeah, cutting back on alcohol is a really another little thing that you can do to start reducing the anxiety that you're feeling.
Yes.
So I love that. I'm just going to recap what I've remembered is you've got your self-care kit, you've got your trying to sit through the discomfort moments, like the itchy nose thing. That was a really good one. Also choosing some tracks or things that you can sit, like meditation, like mindfulness tracks, whatever's going to work for you, do it for you. While we're on tracks, I really like mantras. Like I really got into an artist called David Prevalent, and she's got some really wonderful mantras. They're often played at yoga classes. She's got that kind of music going on. But just sitting with some of these, I found that because there was a vocal that I could hang on to and maybe learn. But because it was Sanskrit, I never really knew what they were saying. So, but it was a really useful hook for my mind to just kind of follow it. And that was, I found those very, very calming. And then what else have you mentioned? Self-care kit, giving up booze, maybe exercise, the nutrition angle going around the back door. Have I missed anything in terms of recapping what are some of the little top tips you've shared with us? Because this has been packed.
I think that covers it well. Maybe give acupuncture a try, but yeah, nutrition is really big for people. And you mentioned Australia, there was a study that just came out of Australia that they found that exercise was more effective than therapy and psychiatric medication. So not great for my field. I mean, obviously therapy is helpful, but exercise is huge. So I always think that's a really good entry point for folks. If you can get out for a 20-minute walk, we see changes in the brain, even just at that level. So it's absolutely worth it.
Brilliant. Well, Lauren, thank you so much for sharing all your expertise on anxiety. Now, if people want to find out more about you, your book, where can they track you down? And also your socials. I mean, you're prolific on lots of platforms. So tell us where we can find you.
Well, Generation Anxiety comes out September 19th is the official day. I'm so excited because we have a special publisher with Watkins that's doing specifically UK and the whole Commonwealth. So you can get on Amazon or wherever you like to buy your books. You can follow along on Instagram and TikTok. I love doing a good mental health meme. And then I speak internationally with teams. So if your company really wants to bring this conversation about anxiety, please join us. I would love to be a part of that conversation with your group.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Lauren, for joining me on the Fear Free Childbirth podcast.